The Tunnels, written by T. Kroll 1113. I'm the only one that's ever been down here. Bill Burke walked us over to the 4-foot by 4-foot rusty steel grate in the floor of an enormous warehouse. And I didn't go far. There's no lights down there, and I doubt that there would be cell service. I didn't want to get too deep and then not be able to find my way out. Bill laughed as Paul and I lifted the grate out of its resting place and dragged it across the cement floor of the warehouse. The warehouse had at one point been a foundry. Bill had been managing the office campus for 5 years, and in the 5 years that he had been at these properties, no one had ever opened this chasm except for Bill Burke. He had learned everything there was to know about the office campus. He was on a first-name basis with most of the tenant employees, and had personally been responsible for every last bit of preventative maintenance in all 4 properties since he had taken over. Bill knew all of the quirks in each building. What leaked where, which rooftop units worked, which ones didn't, what office space got a little bit of a funky smell on a humid day. He was close with the fire department and the police department. He had met everyone important in the town that there was to meet, and he had made sure to make a good first impression on every one of them. He knew that the forest out back was actually federal land used by hunters. And one year during rifle season, he had panicked at the sound of gunshots and had called the police out for an active shooter that turned out to just be a few kids shooting cans in the woods. There was a lot to know about this office park, and Bill knew it all, except for what was underneath this grate. The tunnels below, Bill had hypothesized, were at one point part of the foundry. Maybe to dump or store ore. They could have even been a railway system of some kind to transport materials. There was no signage, no stairway. There were no doors on the outside of the building or bulkheads leading down to another part of the tunnel. There was just this one steel grate in a great big cement warehouse floor that opened up to an empty, dark mystery. The 4 of us stared into the darkness, and I was the first to go in, saying, "No guts, no glory." I had been ecstatic to hear about the tunnels. Mark, my childhood best friend, was soon to take over Bill's job. We had grown up together. We had the same taste in music, movies, TV shows, video games, hobbies, you name it. We had been inseparable since 10, and we had spent 18 years forming a brotherly bond. The kind you can only find when you're school age. On a hot summer Wednesday, I sat in my truck waiting to meet Mark and Bill for a tour of the property. And when I say hot, it was too hot. Most days, I would take either my pistol or rifle bag to work and screw off for an hour or two, hitting the shooting range. I shoot competitively, and practice makes perfect, so any time that I could get was usually taken. But not today. Today, Central Air was my best friend, and if I was getting out of my truck, it was only to go into someplace with AC where I didn't have to worry about sweating through every piece of clothing I had on. On that sweltering August Wednesday, I waited for Mark listening to my morning radio show while the host went on about some poor guy getting a 23-inch dildo stuck up his ass, and I was howling. I had just gotten to when they were talking about how the doctors had to invent some kind of lasso on a prod so that they could reach up in and get it. And that's when Mark's truck pulled up alongside me. He was laughing too. He must have been tuned into the same channel. Bill, who at this point was a stranger, was pulling in not too far behind, so I elected not to ask Mark if he had some time to help me with a problem, perhaps with some kind of lasso on a prod. Much to my confusion, the first thing he said to me when I rolled down my window before our property tour was, "Want to see the creepy tunnels that Pennywise probably lives in?" This wasn't something I was expecting to hear when we met at the building, but still, there was only one logical answer. "Absolutely," I said. However, as it had been the hottest day of the year, we had agreed to hold off for a few days until Friday, when the temperature was set to drop from 98 to 72 degrees. Over the next few days, there was a great deal of excited speculation regarding our upcoming expedition into the tunnels. Amidst repeated jokes of finding One-Eyed Willie's treasure or, of course, a man-eating clown, the group kept in contact with one another until the expedition was thoroughly laid out. I would bring a clipboard and graph paper, along with a 3,500 lumen battery-powered work light. Paul would bring his Bosch laser measuring tool with a maximum range of 165 feet. Between the two of us would lay the responsibility of mapping the tunnels. Mark was also on light duty, with a comparable work lamp and plenty of batteries charged and ready to go in the back of his truck. We discussed it to great length over a bottle of whiskey that Wednesday night. We joked about treasure and clowns, about the Underground Railroad being part of the complex or maybe some secret cave leading to the center of the earth. One thought we had and agreed on was that if these did run under the entire building of the foundry, they may have gone out somewhere. If they still let out somewhere, that would also mean that someone could get in. Now look, if I saw somebody down there in the tunnels, I would be freaked out. Like the end of the world freaked out. There isn't enough power in my brain to process who it could be or why they would be there. I'm no hero. I would look at them, they would look at me. I would stop dead in my tracks, stiff with fear, and do my best to say, "Look, I didn't see you, and you didn't see me." And then I would get out of there, faster than I had ever moved in my life. But that might not be good enough for a stranger in the dark. You never know how someone will act when they're afraid, and I may very well stumble upon someone's home. After jokes about bringing my shotgun or our semi-automatic rifles, Mark and I agreed that we would be wearing our concealed carry pistols. Same make, same model. Sig Sauer P938s, chambered in good old 9mm. I, to this day, still firmly hold to the belief that Sig Sauer are the Cadillac of firearm manufacturers. And I had done my best to convince Mark of the same. We both usually carried anyway, so this wasn't too out of the norm. We just wouldn't be taking them off our belts before heading into the building. The 938 is tiny, subcompact. A lot of people pocket carry them. They're easy to hide, but you never know when your shirt is going to just poke out a little bit, just a smidge too high when you're working. And your typical middle-aged woman working in an office doesn't take too kindly to random guys walking around with guns. So, assuming no one somehow saw us carrying as we walked into the building through the front office and panicked, the plan had been laid. Mark would keep in touch with Bill throughout the week while I kept in touch with Paul. We both couldn't wait to see what was down there, and Paul felt the same way. Paul was the middle-aged outlier in our usual trio. He was much closer to Bill's age than to us. You could only tell that by the grays in his hair and the creases in his face. The 5'6" Irish Italian was a 15-year-old boy in a 49-year-old man's body. So he fit in well with us. And to be honest, I think that he was the most excited in the entire group about what we'd be doing Friday when the heat relented. His 3 daughters couldn't believe him when he told them, and his wife just rolled her eyes. But that wasn't going to hold Paul back. After all, there could be a pipe organ made from human bones that would lead us through a passageway to a pirate ship full of treasure. At least, that's what we hoped the best-case scenario would be. The eye-rolling would continue for some time over the next few days as he went on and on to his kids about how they would soon be flush with gold and jewels, as this was, of course, the most logical outcome of exploring dark, abandoned tunnels under an old foundry. And they were dark. No guts, no glory. I turned on my headlamp and climbed down the stairs into the first chamber. There had to be an inch of dust on each rung of the ladder, already proving that the dusk mask that Bill had brought along were a wise investment. Bill had been the next to come down, pausing halfway to clear off some of the dust and hand down anything bigger than pocket-sized to me so that nobody would have to try and carry anything down the ladder. With the small stash of supplies at the foot of the ladder, I set up the first work lamp to reveal a 20 by 30 foot chamber. a chamber attached to a 20-foot wide tunnel with about a 14-foot high ceiling. The stone walls were covered in the same dark gray dust that now coated my latex gloves, and there was a good deal of it on my boots as well. All around me were piles of broken stone blocks and dirt. While Bill got himself situated, I walked ahead a bit to the first offshoot of the entry tunnel. It had clearly been filled in with debris, not unlike what had been piled up near the ladder. And further on ahead, only another 30 feet or so, was a staircase leading down into another chamber. This one was partially flooded by years of water seeping into the building. This was the epitome of cool. Our greatest fear had been that we would climb down the ladder and find nothing but a small room. That fear was gone now. Mark came next, then Paul, who immediately regretted not taking a dust mask as he pulled his t-shirt up over his face, and we were off to start exploring. Paul was right behind me as we headed down the rotten steel stairway and tiptoed across debris in the water to keep dry, working over to the next stairway up to another tunnel. This one was much longer. After a short walk, we came to a doorway on our left leading to 2 more tunnels, joined by a small common hall to this door, both running parallel to the tunnel that we were standing in. Our second fear, of the tunnels being a bit of a maze and potentially turning us around a bit too much for our comfort, was also slipping away. Climbing through the doorway and over some debris into the other 2 tunnels, Mark and Bill finally caught up to us. We walked up and down, finding graffiti and plenty of broken stone, but little else save a steel water drum that had rotted out about halfway over the decades. What was left of it was an olive drab green, and in unmistakable faded yellow print was labeled as being the property of the Department of Defense. It was a few minutes after this that Bill finally spoke up about taking measurements, which had been the alleged purpose that our team had gone down for in the first place. To this, it was simply a guise to cover our day of exploring, but to Bill, it was still work. So we did. The 2 parallel tunnels off of the main corridor were each 110 feet long, ending in 2 large ventilation fans that hadn't been used in half a century. They must have been the foundry furnaces. Climbing back out onto the main tunnel, however, we measured 97 feet from the doorway to the rusted metal staircase leading to the flooded chamber. In the other direction, we measured a big fat error. It was too far. Wherever this led, it went on for well over 150 feet into the musty blackness. So, naturally, we trekked on. Coming to a double doorway nearly entirely filled in with stone, we had walked about 100 feet from where the measuring point was, and we saw that there was a decent-sized gap at the top of the pile. "We must have sent the laser through that," Paul said as he started scrambling up to take another reading. "We haven't gone far enough to get outside its range." "What's through there?" I said as I stood at the base of the debris pile while Paul stared off into an overpowering dark. His headlamp was clearly defeated. "Nothing, it's just empty space. The laser still isn't hitting anything." That was the first real oddity of the day. We were more than halfway across the building by now. There had to be an end within reach of that thing. "Toss it down here," I called up, and he did. I checked from side to side and floor to ceiling. The measurer was definitely working, which meant that the tunnel definitely kept going. "What do you want to do?" Paul looked at me, and I looked back at the other 2. "No guts, no glory," I shrugged as I started climbing up behind him. Bill was ready to follow. Mark called out for us to wait on the other side while he went back to get the lantern. I told him to leave my spotlight by the ladder as a homing beacon for us. As Mark walked away, one by one we scrambled up one side of the debris, and then down the other side until the 3 of us were sitting together. None of us wanted to go ahead quite yet. We just sat and talked. The minutes ticked by, and he still didn't come back. The minutes kept ticking by, and he still hadn't come back. Nearly a half an hour had gone by, and there was still no sign of him. The excitement had been soured. It curdled in our bellies, and doubt began to set in. What is he doing out there? The ladder isn't more than 100 yards from this doorway. He shouldn't have been gone this long, I said as I started climbing up the pile of debris. Maybe he just slipped on the water and he's out cold, Bill called up. We should all go. I think this is a bust for today. And with that, the two of them began scrambling up behind me. As we dropped over the debris pile and got back to our feet, we looked down the tunnel and we saw the light. It was Mark's. Mine was directional, like a spotlight. The one Mark had brought along was more of an overpowered camping lantern. Where have you been? I called out. Our footsteps on the stone floor were muffled by decades of dust and dirt. I started to slow down because there was no answer. The light was near the end of the tunnel, just by the stairway leading down to the flooded chamber. About another 20 feet past the doorway to the parallel tunnels. I walked ahead while Paul and Bill waited. Slowly, I faded from the light of their headlamps until all they saw of me was my own light. When I made it to the doorway, the lantern was sitting on the floor, and Mark was nowhere to be seen. The doubt was changing. Its seeds took root and started to grow into fear. I stood there silently as every hair on my body was charged with anxiety and my mind raced. I wanted to call out to him, but it felt wrong. There was definitely something wrong. There was a whistle to my right. It was hushed, but it was there. Spinning on my feet, I pulled my gun and pointed it straight at Mark, who was crouched down behind some debris, just out of the range of the lantern. His eyes were wide, and he slowly raised his finger to his lips to hush me before I could speak, and then he waved me over. Kneeling low alongside him, my heart was still going a mile a minute. As I opened my mouth to question him as to why he had done that to me, knowing that I was carrying, he hushed me a second time as he switched off my headlamp and pulled out his phone. Dimming the screen, Mark began to type a message for me to read. It read, "Somebody's down here." A chill ran down my spine. This was not helping my heart rate. I took the phone from him and wrote back, "Are you messing with me?" He read it and shook his head. I deleted the text and wrote a new message. "Where?" He took the phone back from me and wrote a reply as he scanned the dark tunnel around us. "Movement in the water downstairs," he wrote. Cautiously, my head rose over the debris pile, looking down the tunnel towards the flooded chamber. Without the headlamp, the musty black emptiness ahead was impenetrable. The lantern a few more feet down the hall did little to help. It was too far ahead. "This isn't funny," I said in a half whisper, hoping that the ruse would finally come to an end. Mark just stared at me intensely and impatiently. It was a few seconds later that we heard Bill call out to us, and that's when I heard it. A slow, deliberate slosh of the water as the surface tension broke against heavy footsteps. The water was growing louder and louder. The footsteps were getting closer until finally, whoever it was began climbing the rusty metal steps, dripping back into the filthy water in the chamber below as they climbed. Whoever it was close. Very close. I didn't dare poke my head over the debris pile, but I did draw my handgun as I pressed tightly back into the dark corner where we hid. Not a moment too soon either. With the distinct crunching of breaking plastic, Mark's lantern went out. The only light in the tunnel was the light coming from Bill and Paul down the hall. Suddenly, my pocket-sized 9mm didn't seem like enough. Fearfully, I took slow, quiet breaths as I heard the faint patter of water droplets falling to the dusty tunnel floor. They were passing by us and then walking towards Bill as he called out to us again. From behind, as the shadow got closer and closer to them and emerged from the darkness into the pale glow of their headlamps, it disappeared again into the musty blackness when they turned to run. The only sound I heard was somebody climbing back through the doorway into the unexplored section of the tunnels that we had just left. And then, as the second person tried climbing through the doorway, they weren't fast enough. "No!" Bill screamed over and over again. "No! No!" he screamed. He kept going, each more panicked and ear-piercing than the last. The screams were high-pitched as they echoed through the corridors, and they were starting to change. It wasn't just fear anymore. Now it was pain. Immense pain. With a whimpered groan, the screaming finally stopped and the tunnels fell silent again. I couldn't move. The silence didn't last long. Only a few moments passed before we started to hear it. Bill's body was being dragged back towards us in the dark. Mark grabbed my shoulder. "Now," he said as we turned on our lights and ran back towards the entrance. We jumped down the stairway and hit the water with what seemed to me to be the loudest crash anyone had ever heard. There was no point in trying to stay quiet now. We ran through the flooded chamber to the second stairway, back up, and just as we reached the top, there was a splash behind us. It was coming. Mark was ahead of me, but not by far, as I ran as fast as I could on his tail back to the ladder. My gun was drawn, and I wasn't going down without a fight if that thing caught me. Back in the light of the warehouse above, Mark made it up the ladder and waited at the top for me. I hit the bottom and stared up to see the barrel of his handgun pointed back down in the tunnel towards the darkness. He didn't move as I climbed the ladder and jumped off the top rung into the warehouse floor, breathing heavily. Mark stayed in place, staring back down the pit for what seemed like hours. But whatever it was, it stayed in the dark, out of sight. I pulled the grate back over the hole, and Mark stood up by the entrance, watching while I crouched on one knee, and my mind raced, trying to make sense of what had happened down there. I was overcome by an all too familiar feeling of dread. "Mark," I said as I stood back up. "Paul's still down there,